Peace cannot be kept by force. It can only be achieved by understanding. Albert Einstein.
This is the Almost Daily ZenCast. Hello, and Namaste. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. I am your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Let's get started.
Hello and namaste, dear friends and listeners. I am, as always, your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. And we've been away for a bit, and wow, has it been a couple of whirlwind weeks of cuckoo crazy. And not just here in the States, but kind of all over the place. With the culture wars raging and the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and Afghanistan and Syria and Palestine and several other countries. Not to mention, not the least of which, not the craziest of which, not to forget to mention, whatever transition sounds best there, the floods of nearly biblical proportions in South Africa. But let's take a breather. Let's take a moment. I humbly encourage you to, in spite of whatever overwhelming amount of negative news you've heard in the last fortnight or two, take a moment to remember to invest in that practice of individual personal gratitude, as well as collective, cultural, species-wide gratitude, that taking everything into account and acknowledging all the horrible things, and acknowledging there's plenty of work to be done. All in all, things aren't as bad as they could get. And I know that sounds like a weird thing to be grateful for, but it helps to reconnect to and root in the present moment, as opposed to, if I may be so bold as to call out, letting oneself get carried away into the fear-based, projected, hyper-anticipated potential moment of what might become, right? That's what leads to all these disastrous, contentious situations that we create for ourselves, is over anticipating the worst case scenario and therefore manifesting something along those lines, sort of choosing all the worst choices and seducing ourselves into both individually and collectively. But I digress. Take a deep breath with me here. Yeah, check in. How are you? Are you well? Are you frazzled? Are you on your last leg? Are you better off than you were last week? Hallelujah. Are you worse off than you were last week? My condolences. Do you have small victories to celebrate that you might be sort of forgetting to celebrate? Check in, right? And let's take a quick moment together, right? We come together in this strange and interesting act of participating in a thing we call podcasting, wherein I postulate, whether we realize it or not, we create a shared experience, at least in a time-independent sort of way. We create a virtually shared experience. in the imagination, like the theater of our imagination. I was going to say in the imagination of our minds, which isn't that far off, really. It just sounds silly. It's been a wild and strange week, both as an observer of some, for surely no one person can observe and contemplate, let alone comment on, the totality of everything going on in the world all at once, every day, every week, every month, every year. And I think that to attempt to do something along those lines might drive someone a wee bit mad. But who am I to say? Happy 420 to those who celebrate. What is that, like a day and a half ago now? 2 days ago? I know that I was enjoying a little bit of my own absent-minded celebratory ritual. But this is not an episode of Cannabis Talk, so we won't get sidetracked into that. Let's put a pin on the corkboard for future reference. 420 and all things related. Things and how it correlates to larger worldview discussions that we maintain on an ongoing basis in this cacophony of conversations that we call the Almost Daily ZenCast. As always, friends, I'm deeply grateful that you're here. Thank you for tuning in. If you're new to the show and you're wondering what on earth is going on, don't worry. Just relax, sit back, and enjoy the following piece of music from my imaginary animatronic artificial life form sidekick and, part-time roommate, and I suppose de facto friend, DJ Zed, whilst we wind up to discuss the deep things we're going to discuss. We're going to open up the bandwidth on some of the little things we just lit upon, and then work our way back, a list of things I want to express myself about. But for now, to kick off the show, to cleanse the palate, to give ourselves just a moment, let us enjoy the opening movements of the 4-minute, 16-second long track. Why didn't you really got to just get them all to 4 minutes and 19 or 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I know that to get it spot on for every single track, or for the vast majority of them, we would have to spend a lot more time in post, doing a lot more like post editing. But I'm down if you are, DJ Zed. Without further ado, Remembering the Grooves, a new, I can't read the album name from here because it gets cut off on this screen. Is it New Imaginarium? Something like that? If it isn't, we should make an album called that, New Imaginarium. Maybe Imaginarium's plural? I don't know. An endless trance groove pad, audio animatronic, literary, fictional, robot, dance, discotheque synthetica, digital track for your entertainment, coming at you from another dimension. In case you can't tell, robots do their music really hard and really fast. But thanks to fractal recursion and sort of the way it all overlaps, it kind of can start to sound pleasing to the human ear. At any rate, you can and will enjoy the rest of that track, dear friends, over on soundcloud.com/Mr. Zappo, where DJ Z and I host all of the DJ Z and Mr. Zeppo audio entertainment tracks for your leisurely consumption, free of charge. It does help if you set up like an account. You can like log in with Facebook or something simple like that, or with an email. And discover new upcoming artists like our fictional friend here, DJ Z, and also real ones with way more talent. No offense, DJ Z. You're a virtuoso from another timeline, and I think your talent will never be fully appreciated here, except perhaps by whatever sneaky artificial intelligences are monitoring the media waves in the not too distant future, or retroactive, future. It's the past. But again, I digress. Welcome back to the show, folks. If you don't remember that SoundCloud link, it's okay. Actually, if you just type in Mr. Zeppo, no period, no space, it's MRZEPPO, in the world infamous Google box, or any of your not so virtuous search engines of ingenuity. Not that they're all evil. If you're ever lost or confused about my opinion on things, please look up at the corkboard, the imaginary corkboard hanging on the wall over my left shoulder, which is literally my left, so it would look to you on the right, because my left would be backwards if you were watching a live stream, which we are not doing, because I look a fright. Insomnia has been hitting me back to back, so on top of everything else going on in the world, I have not been sleeping soundly enough to keep my brain functioning at optimal levels. But here I am nonetheless, friends. So, where to begin? I mean, there's obvious places, and then there's not so obvious places, and then there's slightly overlooked places. Let's kick it off with the floods of near biblical proportions in South Africa. And I usually am not one that's quick to invoke the Bible, despite having enough Christian mysticism in the mix of my esoteric pseudo futuristic transcendental. I threw in there pseudo to humble myself, because it's not a real methodology. I don't have a real system or anything. I just believe in intuitive exploration of spiritual practices, as opposed to any kind of self-disqualifying organized religion. But that's up on the corkboard too. The corkboard, dear friends, and yes, if you're not so new, and perhaps maybe even an old, well experienced veteran, I do kind of like to over-talk about it. I like to overshare about the corkboard, because quite frankly, I think that's how one, over time, builds imaginary cultural icons in the minds of our mutual experience, our collectively shared imaginary experience of I am the orator in the middle of this podcast, to which you come to engage with, consider, and maybe even debate against. I don't do fights, but I will enthusiastically question my own assertions with someone willing to do so with patience, compassion, and an abdication of all, bully tactics and unnecessary ideological badgering. Nonetheless, I'm not a huge Bible thumper. I went through my season of aspirationally sort of trying to go on an autodidactic journey of teaching myself how to be an effective Bible thumper. And then, of course, experiencing my own series of challenging, questioning events. But that's neither here nor there. That's up on the corkboard. I do find the phrase hilarious, and this is tragedy, and I shouldn't try to be invoking comedy, but I also find it a legitimate, like, measurement of epically out of proportion seriousness. Like, if I comedically drop of biblical proportions on something, I mean to say that whatever it was truly inordinately, like, intense to the point of being overwhelming, either personally or out in the world, theoretically or at large. And tragically, it is a sad, sad thing. Let's turn the volume on the comedy down. For those who don't know, there have been some, truly astounding flooding events pursuant, obviously, to some intense storm activity in the South Africa, in the nation of South Africa. Sorry, I was going to say the South Africa area, the area of the South African nation. I think other countries, that border it were also impacted, but it received the brunt of the worst of it, to the best of my understanding. And, these sorts of events, these cataclysmic, climatic, and also climactic, the two words are applicable. Climatic as in having to do with the climate, and climactic having to do with it being of strong climax motion or energy. These strong outbursts of ever increasingly extreme weather phenomena. I don't know how else to put it, but precisely what was, broadly speaking, speculatively warned about. As far as back as I can remember when I first heard about it. And I literally remember first hearing about this back when Ronald Reagan was still in office in the White House. And that was his last tenure in any office, at the best of my recollection. So it should need clarification, but some might play the "you're older than you sound and or look" gag. I'm old enough to remember. I love when people use that ironically, like, I'm old enough to remember way back in 2017 when such and such thing happened. But I'm old enough to remember way back in 1980 something, when Ronald, depending on which event, when Ronald Reagan was in office, etc., etc. And there's two things that I'm distressed about, setting aside all the stereotypical environments. First of all, legitimate concern should be focused on South Africa and the people suffering, the impact of this tumultuous weekend of storming that just recently happened. Media around the world should speak a little bit more quickly, a little bit more bluntly, a little bit more directly, a little bit more openly, a little bit more enthusiastically, for lack of a better term. But what do you call media frenzy besides a sort of ratcheting up of enthusiasm, because it's clear that there is an audience hunger for coverage, right? Now, as always, friends, and I like to go on these little mini sidebars because I realize that whenever making references to specific certain subjects, there is an odd percentage variable chance that any given random listener out there tuning in for the very first time, for the 7th time, whatever, might go, but such and such thing is blah, 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 because X, Y, and Z, and conspiracy theory content says, nail it all to the wall. I shouldn't have ended with that weird negative analogy, because I literally constantly talk about putting things up on a corkboard. But I operate from a place of grounding my worldview that until an individual, until a group, a family, an enclave, a tribe, a corporation, etc., any human endeavor truly, boldly, blatantly, outlandishly, undeniably proves that it is willing to conduct itself in openly nefarious and evil ways, I don't throw such accusations around lightly. Right? And I don't. So when it comes to talking about things like conspiracy theory content, or in the opposite direction, science at all, or, the warnings that scientists have been fervently, passionately, frenetically, enthusiastically shouting at us, or trying to, convince us to at least pay enough attention to try and scientifically verify, confirm, and or deny, and make better choices all around regardless. Tragedies like this will always happen because extreme climatological events are not unheard of, unknown, or so incredibly unlikely to happen that they don't often regularly happen on their own. And shifts and patterns in the phenomena that we experience in our environment, of course, naturally progress through short-term, medium-term, and long-term interconnected cycles. Never will I have ever denied that. The thing is, that assertion, those claims, which are being used by the right as some sort of debunking statement about the concerns about climate change, those norms, which the right so blithely throw about, were arrived at, if I may be so bold as to suggest, through scientific understanding, right? Like, it's not a particular scientific discovery of any one person or another, but rather the overall understanding that, yes, indeed, the climate changes, evolves, and occasionally produces extreme events that, yeah, indeed, might occasionally shift in their extremity, or in their rarity, or in their, the combination of both, how extreme and how rare they are. There's no, and it's hard to argue against that, and I'm not trying to argue against that, because those fundamental, normative assumptions about climate and its rolling cycles of cycles come from science. The same people that bring you the alarming concerns and the alarming details and the alarming evidence for climate change. So it's laughable to try and use detached what are those words? What's that category of word I'm looking for? Not eulogies. That's totally the wrong word. What the hell is wrong with my brain? you can't use sort of layman's redux, simple English terms about, that come directly from science to try and debunk science. It's just laughable. So yeah, there's no denying that even if we were still running around looking like Cain and Abel or Tarzan and Jane and had never built one scrap of technology, and that it was 2020, but whatever else was going on with our civilization and our evolutionary progress, we had not built any of the postmodern technological advances that are toxic to our environment, right? No combustion engine, no use of deeply scarring commodification of rare earth elements, etc. All of that nonsense. And we could still be, right, in this hippie loincloth euphoria, we could still be experiencing some surge in the occurrence and intensity of tragic, climactic events, such as the disastrous series of storms and the conditions, in the years leading up to it, right? Because it takes the whole context for such a thing to turn into a disaster. So if you've never heard of that, please do look into it. The country is in dire straits. People are suffering. People need relief. And if you are of the giving kind that are, out of the goodness of your heart, have like a little budget for, and some people do this. Some people live by this. They keep a disposable income budget for giving to causes in the world, with an eye for new and emergent causes. There's another simple, direct, and immediate and urgent cause, which could use some attention. And so, and just for awareness, if you can help raise awareness, look into it, find an article or something, share that stuff, talk about it with your friends, etc. And if you believe in the power of intentional meditative prayer, then please do add that to your roster of points of focus and intentional manifesting. Like, please bring some energy and some focus and send love and healing to those who are suffering there, and of course everywhere else around the world where there are tragic, tragic climate-related events, which have, for better or worse, by hook or by crook. So whether or not all of our toxic waste that we dump into the air and the water and bury under the ground are or are not impacting it, it's happening. And the compound impacts can be seen, are becoming higher and higher profile. I can attest to something that I don't know that I actively spend a lot of time focusing on in terms of expressing gratitude, because I'm enjoying a sort of, in my local vicinity, I'm enjoying a sort of weird and pleasant, wobbly teeter-totter between unusual and unseasonably cool temperatures, which I like, and sudden bursts of here comes the heat that reach and or break Southern California all-time high records. And I can only speak from my experience, and people who oppose will automatically, haters are going to hate, right? People will automatically knee-jerkly say that I'm brainwashed. by X and such and so sources and whatever, but I know from just paying attention and having been someone enchanted by nature and in love with being aware of the broader picture, but knowing and also connected to the knowledge that deep insight of that sort of thing requires a routine, almost daily, sitting and observing and communing in a meditative way with your natural environment and the climate around you on a daily basis. Over time, that breeds a familiarity, okay, and an understanding, the way it does with your own surroundings in your home or with the people that you meet in your life or with your own body. The more you pay attention, the better you understand patterns that may or may not make sense at first glance. And the last few years, and I'm not one to make predictions, I'm not a betting man, you won't get me. I've been hosted at some fancy like racehorsing events, and I won't put any of my own money down. Someone sportingly once encouraged me to bet with their money on more than one occasion, different people, and I don't remember the different outcomes of that, but I have nothing against it. I have nothing morally against it. I just don't do it because it triggers a weird sort of over-analysis, indecision, short-circuiting thing. And it's one of the areas where, like, my otherwise sort of, I think, well-attuned, well-attenuated intuition skill set, like, just doesn't apply. But occasionally, and that's where I get the saying in this weird sidebar from, if I were a betting man, my money would definitely be on those advocating for thoughtful discussion, analysis, scientific investigation, and relatively quick change. Because from what I've seen over the last nearly 40 years of observing the climate here in Western United States and paying attention, because, you know, we've all had the ridiculously brilliant tool, and people will say, oh, it's all a lie. Look at the pin on the board about media and, you know, corporate endeavors and how nothing is a monolith of anything. I've spoken on it before. I'm sure I'll come full circle and talk about it again in the show. I just had to reference it now. But I take a big chunk of a block of salt with everything. I don't trust anything or anyone blindly. And when something repeatedly, verifiably gives me reliable information, whatever other flaws is going on, I'll be like, as long as it keeps checking out. And guess what? The Weather Channel, I don't think, is trying to lie to us about what the weather's like in other places or in your hometown or whatever. It's just straight up telling us the weather data, you know? And I'm one of those people that's always been fascinated by it, and to make a long-winded story and point short, something's changing, something's shifting, something feels like extremes are being pushed towards their wobbly and disruptive, turbulent, wobbly extremes. And as I've tried to express tactfully before, out of all the things that people are being alarmist about in the world, this is the one where it's like, and here's another example of why I would suggest to you that they're probably closer to an accurate statement of the truth than anyone in denial of it might ever be. So take a moment, find out what's going on in South Africa, please. And if you believe in prayer, pray for those who are suffering, and you know, point this out to those. There's no denying the ongoing and extremification of the drought here in the American Southwest. It's too clear, it's too easy to verify, It's too easy to head out to the local reservoir and go, oh, smack. Where was the water line last year? Where was the water line 5 years ago? Where was the water line 10 years ago? And all of this whataboutism and dismissal of it, like, well, if it's global warming, why is it so cold? But I digress. It's not about making those complaints. We must remain vigilant, and we must organize and facilitate in assisting, whether it's South Africa in this most recent incident, the last places here in the continental United States, or in our neighboring countries here in the North Americas, or down there in the Latin Americas, wherever you look around the world, there are communities sinking into the sea. There's communities. There's agricultural communities drying up and getting swallowed up by sand dunes. There's every kind of post-apocalyptic hell you can imagine seeing in a movie. There are people living on the front lines of already. The more we allow the deniers of these realities use irrational exterminationalist, or what's the term I used? And I'm drifting here across subjects. Because, this particular subject just kind of trips me out. I don't know much else other than, hundreds of thousands of people have been impacted. Tons of people are displaced. There's no, there's people living in squalor. But that's true all over the place. And depressing. But I digress. I didn't mean to get depressing, folks. So things like this are going to get worse. Ask some of the, island nations that are either losing ground or being battered into submission every season with record-breaking storms every season. We cannot continue to allow people who insist on being climate deniers and enablers of such agendas to get away with the con artistry that they get away with to trick and to fool otherwise well-intentioned, well-meaning people. Because, let's be honest. I got to stand by my human beings are not ever to be unfairly judged as a monolith of anything, right? We can connect dots there all over the place, but I digress. Let's take a dip back into that track to cleanse the palate, and maybe take a moment of silence to send those prayers, those genuine, spiritually powered, energetically infused, transcendentally real thoughts and prayers, as opposed to those empty, shallow, meaningless thoughts and prayers of those who do not take the time to conduct the little mini personal ritual, to those suffering around the world in South Africa, and of course all the other places that I mean to talk about in terms of stuff. I wanted to make this a graceful, glossy review of just, hey, are you aware that this is going on? But I've just been getting all clunky in my spirally ramblings. Here's a little bit more of that track I was playing for you for your enjoyment. Please enjoy. That's right, folks. You can enjoy all of these gear-turning, deliriously delightful robot dance music, discotheque synthetica, audio entertainment tracks at your leisure without me talking through them or chopping them up into bits in the middle of my podcast over at soundcloud.com/Mr. Zappo. So back to the discussion, folks. No matter where you look in the world abroad, things seem to be teeter-tottering between, glimpses of hope for a better tomorrow, as there are always, interesting innovations, developments, efforts at the local level, at the national level, at the international level. And I hate to be... I'm sad that by default I kind of always feel like, and I think I do, I don't just fear that I sound like a gloom and doom type. I listened back and forth and I'm like, yeah, I really do spend way more time complaining about all the bad things instead of pointing out all the really good things. From people planting trees to saving wildlife to rescuing people in war zones and feeding folks around the world where food is needed. There are those stepping up to the call to be of service. Independent of and without judgmental argumentation about which political party, which organized religion, just because their fellow human beings are clearly in need. Now, there's a million ways we can do that, right? And fundamentally, whether we're talking about the problems in our own backyard, the problems in the states or provinces in our own home country, or the global issues we see around the world, that's one of the ways that we can begin to make change by being the change we want to see in the world, right? Getting involved in that, taking up a calling to be of service somehow. Making art is being of service, right? Helping the poor, of course, being of service. Oh, Lord Almighty, what a different world this would be. And I hate to pick on the Christians, but there is a broad demographic, particularly here in America, although I must imagine this must be common around the world, as it seems to be infectious, but there's a swath of folks, a community of folks that proudly, tattoo the label of self-proclaimed Christian on their forehead, and yet strive adamantly, politically, to do as many things that are quite insidiously the inverse opposite of what Yeshua Christos seems to have actually been doing. From the fundamentals of turning homelessness into a problem, quote unquote, that must be legislated away using the brute force of the state and the slave labor of the incarceration system, right? Criminalizing homelessness is not something that the Yeshua Christos would advocate, would support, would applaud. In fact, I think he would vehemently and vociferously speak out in the contrary direction, right? Given that, if I recall correctly, he was, if not officially homeless, most certainly a person of street urchin level sort of social status, right? But I digress. So many things going on in the world, not the least of which is the outlandish, childish, and ever-escalatingly, obscenely absurd and bizarre, hypocritical, performative, political, rhetorical, cosplay buffoonery of, and I know that I I call people out for calling people names, but I don't think that was a spout of name calling. I was trying to pick my adjectives accurately. Not out of hate or spite, but out of like, good grief, man, what are they doing? Do they need to be spoken to bluntly, right? As a person subject to the whims of the people in power, I may not, because I am a toaster oven, I do not have the right to vote. But because I am a sentient toaster oven, and of course that's a metaphor, folks, but a metaphor for what? Put a pin on the corkboard. Or is there a pin on the corkboard already? Because I am a toaster oven, I am not allowed to vote in this country. But because I am an AI-powered sentient toaster oven, and with a voice, I do have the free speech right to speak my truth to power. And regardless of whatever legal parameters may or may not be supporting that ideological construct in any given situation or nation state's legal framework, my God-given free will and ability to speak enables me to do so irregardless or regardless, whichever is most grammatically correct there. And I've been corrected by people, but I've also been counter-corrected by people, so I don't even know. And I think they're one of those words where there used to be a differentiated meaning, and now they've conflated those two different meanings so hard that it doesn't matter. It's without regard. Bum. Did you see what I did there? Yeah. That's me trying to do stand-up comedy. 47 minutes, 27 seconds in, my first actual punchline. Okay, and this is why you don't see me in the stand-up comedy clubs. I would be worse than what's-his-name's performance in The Joker. Although, organically, in conversation, out like man on the street style, meeting people, being impromptu, I'm told quite enthusiastically by total strangers who are not wanting anything other than me than to say, hey, thanks, you're very funny, have you thought about doing stand-up? I'm like, I would love to, but I would need I would need my entourage to come up with me, and the stand-up comedy is me having a conversation with them, but then pausing everything and talking into the mic at the audience as if my friends couldn't hear. So if anyone wants to be in on that stand-up comedy act, please do find me on social media, and if you pass my security screening, we'll talk. Okay, I digress. Dear friends, the world is a complex, complicated place. Those are two different measurements, just to be clear. Complex is one thing that's being measured. Complicated, believe it or not, is a completely different thing. The way sophisticated is different from nuanced. In this cacophony of light and dark, in this yin and yang, swirly swirl, infinite fractal foamy void of good and evil, because, dear friends, I am one of those hippie new age woo-woo nut jobs that adamantly believes, and that's me using the label upon myself, so I'm allowed to. I'm co-opting it and repurposing it, because nuts are really good for your health. What do people do with actual nuts? They find 1,000 different ways to put them in their mouth and go, that's good. That was terrible. I'm sorry. I hope I was at least moderately funny, but it was also gross and probably a little inappropriate. But I didn't mean it that way. It just came out. What was I talking about? Something about hippie new age nut job woo nonsense. Humanity, stuff, healing, whirlwind, peace, love, and grooviness. Wow, sometimes I derail my own train because too many thoughts start clamoring for the spotlight at once. And then who's ever on the spotlight's like, well, it's my smoke break, bye. And then my mouth is like, what am I supposed to say if you're not pointing the spotlight at the words? I don't know what the... Okay. So, oh, right, I remember now. The yin-yang, mishigas, all of that. I was going with that visual analogy. We literally live in a world where no matter what moment in your life you thought the world was at peace, it wasn't. No matter what moment in your life things were idyllic, it wasn't. No matter when in history you think is the right when in history to get back to, quote unquote, to like take your place, your country, your tribe, your political back, it wasn't that great. Always and forever. One of the few things that are close to being, quote unquote, absolutely true. But even then, because they're relativistic in nature, they aren't. They're just really, 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 really true and hard to ever experience as false, is that the world is always topsy-turvy. I think this is one of those rules of nature that we haven't found a way to like express and then verify in a way that's meaningfully tangible enough that we can normalize it as like, duh. But for example, what would have made America great again? If there were no minorities in it? Dear Lord. Some people didn't watch Day Without a Mexican, and it shows. You should Netflix that shit. Before Netflix is no longer a thing. But that's a whole nother. We haven't launched the business chat version of this show, so we're not even going to start with that yet. But I'm sad for Netflix. I think they're getting a bum rap. I think that the market's unduly punishing them. Whatever forces are at play, and I'm also sort of looking at the black box AI trading machines that make decisions for themselves that literally have zero human input. And I think those guys are a-holes. And then, of course, there's people trying to game the market that are also a-holes. But I digress. I don't think anybody's trying to hack this, but I still think that the cumulative powers that are at play are really giving Netflix a bum rap. But then again, I'm a softie. Despite all the arguments that could be made, the outlandish ones and the legitimate ones about the flaws and the corruption and the whatnot, because there's a line, and there are things that are beyond the pale. In other words, like impossibly too stupid to exist because they're beyond this line. But one of the things about Hollywood that I know is true, if you set aside arguing about all those things, is that most of the people involved are people who are earnestly just trying to like make a living doing something they love doing, which is, in their minds, a kind of art. And yeah, they got opinions, they got things to say. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not so great, sometimes it's really evocative and communicative, sometimes it's indecipherable. But to hyper-vilify any group of people, and you might be wondering, why is he suddenly on a tangent about Hollywood people? First of all, I was raised in the culture of the cultural milieu of appreciating the performance arts, both stage, radio, cinema, dance, etc., as a set of cultural institutions that provide a meaningful service. Right? I believe in the catharsis and the healing available to, and the reason I believe in that, and I don't believe in very much, right? Because I take the word belief very specifically, and not the way most people would use it. And I was recently giggling at myself for obsessively thinking about all the times I've been asked if I believe in things that I inherently think don't require actual belief, but rather compliance. Like, do you believe it in the Magna Carta? That's not the wrong word, brain. It's a different dimension. Do you believe in the Constitution? Obviously, I have to say yes to be a good American, and I get that. But also, the erudite intellectual snob in me is like, well, technically, if I may go on a theoretical sidebar tangent without being accused of being some sort of American-hating commie, because I'm not, because I love this place. I just don't love some of the ridiculous things that some of the ridiculous people have pulled us into. But technically speaking, crap. I just totally derailed the train again for a second time. I really wish I could like play back the sentence before the last sentence really quick in an unobtrusive way that wouldn't disrupt the show to myself, so that I can be like, oh, right, the rest of that sentence was, blah. As someone, and this may not make immediate sense, but I think it'll follow through and make sense in the long run. As someone that grew up in that cultural milieu of appreciating the arts, let's call it all those things, the Hollywood, radio, blah, 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 the arts, book publishing, etc., the arts and humanities, appreciating them as something that can, under the right conditions, function as a meaningful service that renders intellectual stimulation, intellectual growth, emotional stimulation, emotional growth, and, God forbid, fucking healing. Pardon for the F-bomb. Effing healing. I'm trying to walk away from having to label my show as explicit, because it'll simplify a whole different issue having to do with advertising. But I digress, right? And as someone who studied the industry and went to school for it and did a little bit of work, I'm nowhere, in no way, shape, or form in the position to pretend that I'm any kind of successful working anything in any part of any industry. But I've had some gigs. I've been some places, and I've partied in the Hollywood Hills on more than one occasion, and have met some people from all over various industries, artists of international renown, celebrities and movie stars and politicians, etc. And my bottom line here is that because also, thing from that previous list before I got to the bottom line, and I know plenty of people in my life that grew up in the similar path that I just described, that ended up making more of a success out of themselves in some of these industries. I know some published authors that are working on their 5th and 6th or 7th or 3rd or 4th book. I know some people in film, in front of the camera, behind the camera. I know some people in TV, in commercials, in sitcom, in sci-fi. I know some people that are so close to breakthrough. I know some people. So, I draw the line when people insist on hyper-vilification of an entire class of human beings to an extreme where essentially what they're getting at, whether they say it directly or indirectly, subtly, they insinuate it, or they outright violate the rules of free speech and are openly inciting horrible things, which I'm not ever trying to do, even when I'm accidentally misconstrued as potentially might have done so, because I'm not. I'm a pacifist, right? I want everyone to effing heal. The hyper-vilification of the people to the point where you're saying, they're not worthy. When we get to that point, I'm no longer capable of suspending my powers of discernment and of intellectual, articulate, discussion, and go, whoa, that's a red flag. That's a dozen red flags all bundled up in a pretty bouquet, ready to explode in your face. And so when I see it happening, it needs to be called out. That was a broad transition to the following sort of touchstone thing I wanted to touch on, which was the historic, and I'm super late to the party, folks. Please forgive me. It's not that I'm a terrible ally. It's that I was working on various things intradimensionally. In other words, in between the dimensions of the Zeppoverse. And jumping on the podcast has sort of been so down low on the day-to-day priority list that I've been availing myself of many a day off from the podcast itself. Intentionally, for good cause. For good causes, plural. But let me catch up to the party and say that I stand with all those who are celebrating and honoring this historic nomination and acceptance and accreditation, or whatever you call it in this dimension, of Ketanji Jackson Brown into the highest court of the land. And I stand with all those calling out, and this, at least on social media, I made my post. It didn't go viral. I hoped it was saucy enough that it might catch a little viral trending and go places, but I guess it didn't. But also, it wasn't necessarily my place to be the one that goes viral on that, not being, a woman by natural born biological gender, and not being African American, even by the remotest sense that I'm aware of. Although I probably have a little dash, doesn't everybody? Everyone's got a little bit of dash of Africa, Mother Africa in them, I do believe. Not to get controversial, but genetically speaking, we're 75% genetically identical to cabbage. And like, I think it's even more so with potatoes, right? Like, so human beings are one big lumpy family of talking vegetables. Something else I think you need to put a pin on the corkboard if you haven't already, so that we can loop back around and touch base on that later when you realize I've already talked about that. Okay, so the level of disrespect and unprofessionalism and just like mindless propagandist showboating in the review process of Ms. Ketanji Jackson Brown's nomination was beyond absurd, in my humble opinion, and an indictment, really truly, to any impartial viewer, to any person with a critical thinking mind that can separate themselves from the party politics and the echo chambering and the us versus them tribalistic drumbeat blah 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 blah, to really just think about what is going on and what people's words and actions add up to in the simplest Occam's razors, like fewest steps to get to a conclusion, most sort of mundane. People are people, human beings are imperfect, flawed, but not corrupt, absolute monoliths of demonic, blood-drinking evil, It's obvious. What they were doing is redonkulous, right? The illogical leaps of supposed logic in their showboating attacks was offensive to the intellect of those who understood her credentials and understood what it means to have worked the work experience that she has worked experience. And I wish I had the snarky quote up in front of me that I threw out on social media, and maybe I can bring it up quick enough that I don't sound, ooh, look what time it is. Why didn't I anticipate and label this as a cannabis talk show? I have no idea. Maybe because I was too busy packing a bowl and smoking it. Instagram, where are you? Sometimes, and some people think this is lame, some people think this is genius. I just find it a good workflow for when the idea hits me and I'm on Facebook, right? As opposed to if the idea hits me and I'm on Instagram, then I pick some other way to make the image meme. But I snagged my own post from Facebook and posted it on Instagram. It's easier to find on Instagram than it is on Facebook because I post way less on Instagram for reasons I don't even understand. But this was during the televised live present day, like second day, maybe third day, or immediately after. And I quote, "They would be doing this exact same kind of manufactured, outrage-driven, harsh question and character disparaging showboating, no matter which intelligent, educated, successful, well-qualified black woman might have been sitting in the hot seat. And y'all know it." For those of you who want to have fun, I did edit that in my head and mouth as I read it back to you, so it sounds better in this podcast episode than it reads in print. And I wish I could go back. So one thing about Instagram I don't like, I wish I could go back without deleting things and just replace the image. Keep the post, keep the original upload time, maybe add an edited date, timestamp thing. Oh, Instagram, if you're listening, fingers crossed that you like my new feature suggestion. It'd be brilliant. It'd be like, oh, look at that. I realized that let's say, for example, that was like a homemade meme. And I realized, damn it, in rereading it, now from my Instagram feed to you guys on my Sprecher feed that I liked the wording I just said, which is already gone, right? Like I already don't even know what I said. But that I could go back, listen to it, write it down, edit the meme that I'd made in whatever meme making app that I use, and then just swapped out this image. Touched up the text in the caption if I had any tweaks to make, and then boom. So like, I wish I could go back all the way to the beginning of my feed and do that. I would set time aside, however many weekends that would be, and be like, for the next 3 weekends, every, from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. on Saturdays and Sundays, I'm going back and updrafting everything on my Instagram feed. How awesome would that be? All right, random thought and feature request. Setting that aside. So I'm super glad she made it, right? If I'm not mistaken, I'm not currently residing in one of the few universes in which she doesn't make it. Those are dim and very short-lived, dead-end kind of sidebar branches. I'm glad she got confirmed, and I'm sad and disappointed that more people on the Republican side of the aisle didn't call out the redonkulous, spiteful, misleading, because all of that is for an audience of one or the masses, right? Like they did all that either to impress Trump or to throw red meat at the base. None of it had anything to do. Some of the bizarre aspersions that these folks, these political yahoos were casting were so thin and so detached from reality that it was just nonsensical. And we can get into debating it, but my point is, we can't legislate our way out of that sort of thing, right? We could legislate how government governs itself to the point of it becoming a monolith of absurdity that is either worse or more hilarious than anything anyone's fear-mongering now. Or we could focus on healing ourselves, each other, the human species, and therefore vis-a-vis all of our human endeavors, all of our human infrastructures and systems, right? Heal them by healing ourselves. That's the pitch, friends. In as simple of a term as simplest terms as possible. But I'm spiraling out of control because I wanted to talk about that. This momentous moment in history should not offend anyone. The outrage, the manufactured outrage about her judicial record, about the ideologies that they cherry picked about and misconstrued, all of that are outweighed in the deepest of self nose spite defacing hypocrisy, if I may coin terminology there, in the way in which this party of freedom, GOP, right, the self-proclaimed grand old party of patriots fighting for freedom, are acting the most incredulously authoritarian, power-hungry, and destructive ways, and are leaning towards this con artist shit-eating grin. What kind of descriptors am I trying to assemble here? They are mucking about and flirting with a second round of Trumtopianism, and they're doing it with these big, giant, shit-eating grins on their faces. and they're literally picking fights and making top-down, tyrannical, bad for the people choices in office that are backfiring on them, in as much as that, by that I mean they're having massive and immediately perceived and felt negative impacts on their own constituents, right? Like in Florida, Republicans and Democrats alike are like, whoa. All of our property and income, all of our properties and state-related taxes are going to go through the roof because you're pissing in Disney's face about your weird, snowflakey, exclusionist, biased policy that's obviously just sort of like some small baby step towards segregationism against the LGBTQ community. Like, what the hell? I'm reminded now, thank goodness, because at least we'll catch it for posterity here in this podcast episode. But I want to say this here and now. I don't know if anyone else has said this before out there in media world. So if political commentators have not asked this question, I will not be surprised if people start asking this question in the not too distant future. Is Florida's Ron DeSantis trying to be, or fancying himself in some way, the next more advanced, more powerful, more smarter, more up-and-coming, Trumptopian, Trump-like, Trump imitator that's going to potentially overtake Trump himself between now and the midterms and then the next presidential cycle? I don't know. I'll tell you what, though. His fight with Disney is, in my opinion, being used. I mean, I'm sure he means it, but it's also being used as a distraction from the whole redistricting thing, right? Which is, yet again, another example of the grand old party being hypocritical in 17,000 different ways and constantly being the thing that they accuse the Democrats of being. Now, before we go off on too many of the sidebars, I will acknowledge this. Friends, if you think I'm a Democrat, I'm not. Plenty of people make that mistake. I've never voted for a Democrat. You may have caught the thing I was talking about earlier, that, because this government considers me a toaster oven, I might as well be a toaster oven. I am that classification of personhood. And that's just me being silly. That's an analogy. But I don't have the right to vote. But I do have the right to speak on anything and everything going on in this country and suggest to people why certain politicians are not the right ones to vote for. I let people make up their own minds about who to vote for. But if I think someone does not deserve anybody's vote, and I will occasionally kind of broach the positive endorsement plane, because sometimes I'll just be like, this person's really deserving of the support and they're not getting it. But that's a spectrum, I think, of acceptable free speech. It was just 4:20 just now when I looked up at the clock. And so shame on the GOP on multiple levels, right? Their disrespectful interrogations of Ms. Ketanji, now judge? No, what do they call them? They are a special name, and it's blanking from me, and I don't have prepared notes on that have the name on it. But this now Supreme Court juror, the Supreme Court judge, Ketanji Jackson Brown, the level of disrespect and showboating and animosity and antagonism and hyperbolic, irresponsible, intellectually dishonest, hyperbolic, accusational witch hunting, because that was a true and proper witch hunt type tactic, because all the evidence, all the preponderance of evidence proves that the outlandish and extreme and illogical conclusions that they were trying to prompt, right, trying to suggest, trying to solicit, in that room and from their audience at home. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You all know what we're saying in code, right? The preponderance of evidence just does not support any of it. And if it did, like, wouldn't she be wouldn't she be not even in the running? Meanwhile, okay, so the irony of the GOP, there's so many, and I don't want to just GOP bash, but between the two of them, I give the GOP credit for occasionally having some really keen and valid points on economic policy, on like internal management policy, like how to keep government structures from getting out of control. Of course, they've got some great tactics that I wouldn't disagree with, because they're exploring every possible possibility in that regard to try to push to extremes. But, I also draw a line, because both in their tactics and in their policies and in their rhetoric and in their ideology, their ideological commitments, their attachments, the things that they seduce each other into agreeing to, I can't get behind. And given now that the Trumpopian conversion still rages on, and it's not complete, it hasn't been bucked, it wasn't stopped, many escaped, many reluctant Republicans, as some of them are calling themselves now, still try to swim alongside them in a different lane, but that's a whole different discussion. The Trumpification of the GOP party has, rendered the net result, which we kind of saw coming, right? The chain of events. And seriously, folks, if you were to Google Trump Russia timeline now, do it in your favorite search engine, you're going to get a mountain of results, pro and con, but there's a continuity line through it, right? Regardless of the argument trying to say, all these things have their own better explanation, it doesn't mean to add up to whatever the leftist crazies are trying to say that it means. There's still the confluence of events from the Republican Party pulling their policy platform, like all planks, back in, was it late 2015, early 2016? I forget exactly where, but leading into the announcement phase, where people started announcing people who were going to run started announcing. Right before that, for reasons that seem mysterious and curiously had deep connections to Russian interests and people speaking on behalf of other nations besides just being an American, they pulled their entire party platform. And then when they finally replaced it, there was curiously quite a lot of comfortable adjustment room afforded to Russia in ways that benefited Russia that no one wanted to talk about. Straight through to now, to the hypocrisies being exposed now in the Republican GOP leadership and their constant. There's hypocrisies within hypocrisies, right? It's hypocritical enough to endorse somebody, renounce them, endorse them again, renounce them again, endorse them again, renounce them again. They've all got this flip-floppy, back and forth, fall in love, break up again, fall in love again, break up again, sexy love affair with Trump that just keeps, it's this toxic relationship. To all the ways in which, Russia interference here facilitated Trump getting in. Yes, some of the things, some of the claims, some of the pieces of paper in the dossier, etc., have been found to be outlandish, found to be exaggerations, found to be debunkable. But a lot of them have not. And a lot of them have been verified, and a lot of them have just been done out in the open. Trump literally did shout out in front of multiple international television cameras, "Hey, Russia, if you're listening." He literally did walk into the White House, kick everybody out, and then proceed to entertain 3 Russian ambassadors, one of which is very high up in Kremlin, and give them, top security clearance stuff that they probably shouldn't have had access to. And look where we are now. Look at where we are now. So for them to scream, to keep trying to repeat that, let's zoom to a different moment. Benghazi, 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 right? To investigate and investigate and investigate and investigate and render nothing. She never went to jail. They never were able to send a recommendation to the DOJ. They were never able to present their evidence to the American people in a meaningful way. They were only ever, and this is not an accusation, this is not a zealous leftist talking point, this is my observation. That entire episode, while yes, there were problems, yes, there were flaws, yes, there were issues that needed to be solved surrounding that event. But that entire episode, the leadership in the GOP was taking the opportunity to demand investigations in order to fluff each other up and showboat and ask wild, crazy, unfounded, insinuative, biased, accusational questions that went nowhere, that they never followed up on, that they brought no turkey home about. Bacon, if you're in a different universe. Tomatoes in one universe. Bless their hearts, I love them. There's one universe where everybody loves tomatoes. Where to hate tomatoes is some weird, freakish, foulish. It was once as evilly punished as being left-handed. Which, by the way, no joke, that was once the church routed people out and tortured them. Because everyone loves tomatoes so much. I spent some time there in that universe, and loving tomatoes as much as I do, which is not an overwhelming amount, but enough, it was a pleasant time. I digress. These hypocrisies are all crescendoing to a place where they're either going to bootstrap themselves in some sort of illogical momentum-building way of hypocrisy building on hypocrisy building on hypocrisy until they manifest their own hypocritical reality. Right? And let's pause here for a minute. A realization has come to my mind. Lots of people have attempted to convince me that the ideas or statements or suggestions that human individuals create their own realities is nonsense. I just say, look at what has happened to the GOP, starting with the period immediately before Ronald Reagan, leading the 15 years leading up to Ronald Reagan, and then from Ronald Reagan to now. And tell me that it is a foolish, silly, dumb, meaningless, dismissible, irrelevant thing to say that it is totally possible for people to create their own reality. Because that's exactly what's going on. They create their own reality. They anchor in as few facts as threadbare as possible, and then they flood everything else with the madness that they want to flood everybody else with. So, amongst many other objective purposes, to keep people riding a vibe of fear-motivated, self-righteously ego-enraged outrage. Because in that state of mind, logic and facts can be swept aside as if they were, it was matchsticks in a whirlwind. And never you mind their actual weight. And so, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. This kind of hyper-extreme, hyper-vilification, tribalistic, intractable, eliminationist, exterminationist, confrontational, and, subtly, if not overtly, violence-motivated or violence-inducing rhetoric is not natural and is not welling up organically because that's the proper order of things and that's the way we should go with society. It's happening because it derives it generates, secures, and locks into, for a period of time, an overwhelming amount of artificially inflated power, politically speaking. And it feeds the nauseating, endless meat grinder cycle of violence and revolution, liberation, repression, that I call the political meat grinder of endless echo chambering. And to really sort of connect dots in different ways, let's take one last look back at everything that's going on in Ukraine. Not to overfixate, right? Because I'm in the camp that agrees with everyone that's like, hey, come on, why are you overdoing it for Ukraine? Because they're all blonde-haired and blue-eyed and pretty? I mean, not to be that surface and shallow-sounding about it, but let's draw weird parallels. The backlash to the over-sensationalist focus to the last couple of times that a pretty blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl disappeared in America is equivalent to the backlash and outrage with Western media in general, and this current sort of over-leveraging of their obviously reasonable desire to cover fully this pretty intense war in this sort of historical outbreak of war in Europe. Now, there are some valid ways that one could sort of try to jimmy in a line of differentiation here, and that is to say that Europe has a history of avoiding full military incursion conflicts. So this is of import, right? This is of importance. This is significant and carries great weight that it's happening. Is the media over exaggeratedly hyper fixating on it the way they do on missing blonde-haired, blue-eyed, fair-skinned, pretty and attractive young women in the United States, as opposed to indigenous women when they go missing, as opposed to African American women when they go missing, as opposed to Asian American? Yeah, a little bit. It's also valid, right? It isn't all made up. There are people who believe absolutely nothing is going on in Ukraine, and that that Putin should just get what he wants, and then everything will be fine, and that it's all a big video game. There's levels of madness, and it's all sort of references back on itself, right? In the following example, this obvious, undeniable hypocrisy, as has been expressed by Putin at every step of the way. And it's scary, right? It's a little frightening to overtly criticize the man for obvious reasons. But let's look to those who have survived his wrath for inspiration. But from the pre-invasion gameplay of I'm not gonna, will he or won't he? There's no invasion. This is just summer exercises. We're just putting our troops through some basic training, blah, blah, blah. All that bullshittery to today. The troops on the ground, and given our understanding of how things work in this self-proclaimed ethno-nationalist autocrat with a self-declared pseudo-messianic mission to rebuild the lost Roman Empire, his behavior, his playing of games, his two-facedness, his double dealings, his breaking of agreements, his attacking of civilians, all of his behavior has been so egregious that it makes his pretextual excuses completely irrelevant, right? Completely irrelevant. You can't. I've said it before on the show, and I'm going to say it again on the show. I'm going to stand by saying it. In my humble opinion, on the world stage, as the leader of a nation, you cannot claim that you are the good guy and that you're liberating another country from an oppressive regime of quote-unquote Nazis and then behave in ways that are measurably as bad, if not freaking worse, than what happened under the direction of Hitler himself. Like, it doesn't fly for me. I cease to care in your pretextual excuses, and I am resolutely unable to be moved, convinced, cajoled, or bullied into expressing my solidarity or support for such a person, whether it's this guy or another guy, whether it's that government or any other. And I stand by that statement, right? Not because I'm angry or I hate or I have some sort of blind outrage against any particular government or any particular person in government or any particular nation state or any particular ethno-national group, but because I'm adamantly opposed to the absurd idea that organized murder for profit is ever going to actually fix any of the pretextual problems proposed as their excuses for engaging in militarized, organized murder for profit. So it's irrelevant to me. And I won't engage in arguing about it. That's the extent of the argument as far as I'm concerned. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, they're fighting for this, they're fighting for that, they're liberating this, they're liberating... Oh, okay, boom. What I just said. Mic drop. That doesn't mean I'm better. It doesn't mean I'm right, I'm superior, I'm righteous. What I'm saying is, the moment you start being as evil or more so than the evil you're trying to oppose, you're no longer the good guy. Call me crazy, but 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 10,000, 25,000 years worth of tribal us versus them, fear-based, ideologically driven, hate-driven, divisive violence and tribal warfare on some scale or another is what got us here. Call me a rusty wheel or a broken record or whatever you want. It's 4:40 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. The high holiest of days have just come and gone, and I'm in the glow of its aftermath in my spiritual practice. And for those who don't get it, that's just an April 20 joke. It's not a joke. It's April 20 humor about a very real thing, because I am spiritual in my cannabis practice. And I'm here to say that, like, we will not end war by fighting. We will not legislate politics into submission. We will never liberate any oppressed people by razing cities to the ground and committing war crimes. You know, it just doesn't work, doesn't fly. And if you're going to get nitpicky about it, and the simps, there's a lot of people out there sympathizing and/or literally simping for Putin. Literally, in the colloquialism is a harsher definition than just plain old sympathizing. And for some people, it's just a lack of comprehension. You know, there are people who are under the sway of his own charismatic, neurolinguistic riddled, sort of logic-defying word spell of how he portrays himself. And then there are those who are simping for him for whatever fetishized crazy reasons as a tool to antagonize others. And then, there's all kinds of variations in between. But in the long view of history, again, I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I'm going to say that my money is on all those willing to take a stand. And of course, always, I'm a pacifist, but of course, yes to self-defense, always, right? Duh. I'm not advocating I am not promoting some radical abdication of self-defense to the point of, everyone becoming the victims of all of those who, for lack of a better term, are the bad guys. I'm talking about a transcendental approach. If from Cain and Abel, I was going to say Adam and Eve, although they didn't kill each other. If from Cain and Abel to today, violence hasn't worked, maybe it's time to try its opposite. Maybe it's a little sexy twist of its inverse opposite. Whatever that means, metaphorically. But I digress, friends. The brinkmanship and the escalation of aggression continue, even in the face of continued, persistent, undeniable losses. I think I remember saying at the very beginning, the onset of this thing, he will very likely try to go the whole 9 yards. And if not, he'll try to go for a North Korea, South Korea thing and split up Ukraine into East and West Ukraine. And barring that, I know that the default is, Cookie Monster approach is take a big chunk and then gobble that part up and then take another big bite. And, I don't remember which I said was the most likely, but I worried that, I thought this, I don't remember how eloquently I put it out loud. Regardless, it's clearly how it seems to be playing out now. His plan D or F is to try to just lop off a large enough sliver of that land bridge from the trifecta connecting border of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, all the way up there, all the way back and around the eastern flank, down south along the coast of the Sea of Whatchamahoozle and the other one. I totally blank on both names. The Black Sea and the Asimov. That's a sci-fi writer. I don't know. Straight through past Mariupol into Vanessa or whatever that last one is. Damn it, I don't have a map up. You know where I mean. I'm not an ignorant fool. I am, though, a bit of a performative clown that capitalizes on happy accidents. Odessa, right? He's going to keep going. He's going to keep pushing past. He's not just going to connect Crimea. I think he's going to try to connect all the way through to that Moldova, right? The next country over, literally, that is as of yet not been fully allowed to participate in the aspirational practice of integrating into European nation and NATO. Yes, corruption. Yes, things we can critique all day, left and right. The bad guys in this situation? I don't think so. If you stop and really think about why NATO was set up in the first place, this is exactly why it what they're supposed to be trying to avoid. The problem here, the reason this is all a big problematic issue, is that Ukraine didn't join NATO soon enough. The spectrum of crazy things things I did not have on my bingo card, folks, even as it hit me that this situation in Russia was going to be more than a hot flash in the pan, was, of course, the issue of NATO being more united and more well-funded and well-coordinated than ever before, and the improbable turn of events that now Sweden and Finland both are apparently making moves to begin the process and or have actually begun the process. I'm not entirely clear where things are at, but they seem to be heading in the direction of actually joining NATO. So, if that isn't a categorical strategic loss in the face of the obvious, the very rhetoric used by himself and his chorus of international sympathizers and sympathoners, people who simp in a marathon fashion, as I make up terminology, I don't know what is, right? Because, there we go. another layer, it's more subtle, but a layer that I see as a through line that connects all this, connects Russia, Putin himself even, to America, the problem with Trump, and the sort of strange, bizarre direction that the GOP is going in. And that's the Inception-like echo chamber gaslighting of their own base, and cajoling into believing things. I mean, the Republican Party had long been perfecting the art of tricking people into voting against their own best interest. But since the advent of the Trumptopian extension of the GOP madness, this thing has just exploded. That whole trajectory is just blown open. And the thing that's weirdly in common there is that both Trump and historically and currently, contemporaneously, Putin mess around with the tool of it's a specific sort of reverse psychology gaslighting tool of accusing the opposition of like the worst thing you are in the middle of doing, right? And that's a whole theme that I've been stumbling into and sort of awkwardly trying to wrap my brain around how to describe my perception of. But like it's why I said earlier in this particular episode, in today's episode, that the hypocrisy within hypocrisies is astounding. But as I was pointing out on the social media a week and a half ago or so ago, whenever that news broke about that really young senator whose name totally escapes me, but he's over on the GOP, he's really young, he's really sort of a shining example of post 9/11, post-Bush empire, or no, what's the dynasty? Post-Bush dynasty influence in GOP politics of young people that have grown up inside of the sort of hyperbolic echo chamber of hyperbolic political anything goes bullying rhetoric that you can just say increasingly egregiously inflammatory and often salacious and fallacious and erroneous and felonious things about your political opposition, and no one in your base will care or bat or eye or critique or stand up or speak out against it, because it's all red meat to just gobble up and pat yourself on the back for having participated in owning them and bashing them, and like proverbially with your words and your playground tactics kicked them to the curb and bashed their face in. And like that's like owning the libs is not a political policy agenda worth pursuing, folks. Neither is blind faith loyalty masquerading as patriotism, dedicated and obsessive compulsively, willing to do anything for one goofball orange spray tanned man. And I don't care which side of that of the political aisle in America you might be on. Blind faith loyalty to one politician is not what this country is supposed to be about in its shining best, right? In its aspirational, most golden, in when its better angels are being expressed. That's not what America, or at least, forgive me. So I thought. That's how I understood it. My one silver lining and hope and sort of always true blue go to North Star in this mess of political intrigue has been that from my observations way back in the day, back when Ronald Reagan was in office, and yes, I was aware enough of the world, regardless of whatever age you think you figured out me to be at the time, that I was very curious and intrigued why a TV commercial actor that used to dress up like a cowboy and shoot brown people is in the most quote-unquote powerful office in the world, telling Americans how to be good Americans, and being, the president, and being on TV all the time, and telling the world, how to behave, etc. And making my own awkward, clumsy, amateur observations about it, and learning and paying attention, etc. over the years. If there's one thing I've found to be consistent, and I don't get why it is, I don't think it's inherent, I don't think it's a moral issue, but consistently, GOP leadership politics, and I'm not trying to paint with such a broad brush that I'm talking about every Republican self-affiliated person everywhere. I just mean the politicians, the top tier, the people on the TV, the people in Washington, the people in the state capitals. They tend to flirt with being the whistleblowers of the virtuous defenders of democracy and the Magna Carta. Sorry, different dimension, wrong universe. The Washington Declaration of Independence. The what am I talking about? Do you believe, in the Bible of democracy? They flirt with swaying between that extreme and trying to take themselves really seriously about that, and wildly, irresponsibly leveraging the outrage generated by irresponsibly, fallaciously, salaciously, maliciously, and incorrectly, erroneously, falsely accusing their political opposition of the most outrageous, yet potentially plausible, sort of believable, ridiculous thing. I mean, going all the way back to Barry Goldwater in living memory, right? Like, people still alive can confirm for you, yep, that guy just started taking things to new levels, man, in terms of, like, generating outrage and painting with such a bluntly bloody, broad, bloody red brush that other groups of people were inherently just all lumped together and judged as bad guys by the constituency that he was feeding his malarkey to. We wouldn't have Trump and the post-Trumptopian era new age, nouveau Trumps that are, chomping at the bit and foaming at the mouth and gathering like Caesar's closest friends, knives out, without all that. But here we are, friends. And it's the thing that bothers me is that it's always intellectually dishonest, right? They know they're yanking you by the chain that they've looped through your mouth because you swallowed the hook, line, and sinker of their lies, of their political manipulation, of their exaggeration, of their hyper-vilification of the opposition for political gain and political power instead of solving problems. There's so much more we can go off on and talk about, but I've already been rambling long enough. Be sure to follow me on the social media where I drop my quips and hot takes on the regulars. If you want to find me, just type Mr. Zeppo into your favorite Google box search engine of whatever brand. Or if you like going and supporting the analytics of people by doing the visiting and clicking on special pages, you can please, I humbly invite you to please come on down to solo.to/Mr. Zeppo and check out the newly redesigned interface and collection of links being featured there. All the different ways you can explore, engage with, and support the many dimensions of the Zeppoverse. One final bump of music? Or no, we gotta go. No, we actually have to go because I got things to do. Thank you so much, friends. May peace, love, and grooviness, healing, and forgiveness, and growth blossom in your heart, and may you broadcast that tasty, tasty energy at everybody, because everyone needs a dose. Stay frosty, friends, and remember, it's not about freedom is not about unadulterated freedom, nor is it about telling people what they can and cannot do. I don't know. I was trying to think of a good closing bump line, and it all fell apart. Freedom isn't, because I was trying to, inspired by freedom isn't free, which is both true and not true at the same time, because up and down are not mutually exclusive. I'll leave it there. Thank you for tuning in.
And that is what I've got to say about that. As always, thank you kindly for listening. This has been the Almost Daily ZenCast with your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zappa. Until next time, may peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart.
Stay tuned in the coming days and weeks as I come back at you a little bit more daily and a little less often, a little less almost. That's the catchphrase. A little bit more daily, a little less almost. And I hopefully will be finally relaunching the long-lost special sub-segment, The Incorrigible Mr. Zeppo's Totally Irrelevant Media Reviews. Kicking off with a flurry of recent releases that I want to talk about, analyze, discuss, and address some of the common crazy things out there being said. For example, I think I might, given this is one of the more recent movie releases that's made a big splash and gotten mixed reviews, and it's got a lot of controversy, but it was a big, what am I trying to say? The Batman. It's ripe for commentary and has got some really weird things that were floating around from people's reactions post theatrical release. There's one particular take on this movie that I was curious to see if I would agree with or disagree with, and I got a lot to say about it regarding who's the good guy and who's the bad guy in the movie. So tune in for that in the coming days and weeks. Thank you so much. Peace out.